Hello, dear friend. Welcome back to our quiet corner of the world. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. If you're new, welcome. Find your coziest spot, wrap yourself in a warm blanket, perhaps light a candle if you have one nearby. Let the weight of the day fall away. This time is yours, a moment of peace, a journey into a story that I hope will warm your heart on this cold winter's night. Tonight, I have something special for you, a story set on Christmas Eve in 1955, when trains still rumbled through the night carrying travelers to destinations both known and unknown. It's a tale of a man who thought he'd lost everything, only to discover that sometimes the things we lose make room for what we were truly meant to find. This is a story about second chances, about communities that embrace strangers, about love that's patient enough to wait, and about the courage it takes to admit we were wrong and start again. Before we begin our journey, if these kinds of stories speak to your heart, I'd be so grateful if you'd take just a moment to subscribe and click that bell. It truly helps this channel grow and ensures you'll never miss a tale. And if you're already part of our little community, welcome home. Your presence here means more than you know. Now then, let the world outside fade away. Close your eyes if you wish, or simply let your gaze soften. Let my voice carry you to a railway platform on a snowy December evening, where a man stands with a single suitcase, about to board a train that will change his life forever. Our story begins with an ending, or so he thinks.
The snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes when James Whitmore stepped onto the platform at Grand Central Station. It was Christmas Eve, 1955, and the great terminal was filled with the sounds of celebration. Families reuniting, children laughing, carolers singing in the main concourse. All around him, people were going home. James was running away. At 34, he was too young to feel this old, but the weight in his chest had been there so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. His overcoat was expensive but needed cleaning. His shoes were well made but scuffed. His face was handsome in that sharp, angular way that looked good in photographs but suggested a hardness that hadn't always been there. In his left hand, he carried a single leather suitcase containing everything he'd thought worth keeping. In his right pocket, a one-way ticket to Portland, Maine. Not because he had any reason to go to Portland, but because when he'd walked up to the ticket window and the clerk had asked, "Where to?" his mind had gone blank, and Portland was simply the farthest north he could think of. North seemed right. Away seemed right. Anywhere but here. He found his train at Track 23, a sleek diesel locomotive that would make the journey overnight, arriving in Portland just after dawn. The platform was less crowded here. This wasn't a popular route on Christmas Eve. Most people were traveling shorter distances to nearby suburbs and family homes. Only a handful of passengers waited to board. James found a seat in a nearly empty car toward the rear of the train. He placed his suitcase in the overhead rack, settled into the window seat, and watched the snow accumulate on the platform outside. The train wasn't scheduled to depart for another 15 minutes, and he spent that time studiously avoiding eye contact with anyone who might try to engage him in conversation. He didn't want to talk. Didn't want to exchange pleasantries or hear about anyone's Christmas plans. He just wanted to sit in silence and watch the world slip away. A conductor walked through the car, an older black man with kind eyes and a musical voice. "Merry Christmas, folks. We'll be departing shortly. If you need anything during the journey, just let me know. Name's Porter, and I'll be looking after you tonight." James nodded without speaking, and Porter moved on,
his cheerfulness seeming genuine rather than forced. It irritated James somehow that anyone could be genuinely happy today of all days. 3 years ago, he'd been happy. 3 years ago, he'd been engaged to Catherine Morrison, the daughter of one of New York's most prominent families. 3 years ago, he'd been a rising star at Morrison and Fletcher Architects, designing buildings that were changing the Manhattan skyline. He'd been on top of the world, with everything he'd ever wanted within his grasp. Then came the accusations, the whispers, the investigation that found nothing criminal but ruined him nonetheless. Someone had been embezzling from the firm, skimming money from construction budgets and pocketing the difference. When the discrepancies were discovered, suspicion had fallen on James. He was the project manager, after all. The budgets went through his hands. And when questioned, he'd made the mistake of trying to deflect blame, of suggesting that perhaps others in the firm should be investigated too. That had been his downfall. Not the embezzlement, they never proved that, but his defensive reaction, his implied accusations against colleagues who'd worked at the firm for decades, his willingness to throw others under the bus to save himself. In the end, they'd found the real culprit, a junior accountant who'd confessed and been quietly dismissed, but by then, the damage to James's reputation was done. He'd shown himself to be the kind of man who'd sacrifice anyone to protect his own interests. The partners no longer trusted him. Catherine's father had strongly suggested the engagement be called off. His colleagues had iced him out. He'd resigned 6 months ago, unable to bear the cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Since then, he'd been living off his savings, taking freelance drafting work when he could get it, and slowly dissolving into bitterness and self-pity. Today, Christmas Eve, his landlord had given him notice. The building was being converted to luxury apartments, and his rent-controlled studio was in the way. He had 30 days to vacate.
It had felt like a sign, a final push from the universe telling him it was time to go. So he'd packed his suitcase, bought a ticket, and here he was, waiting for a train to carry him somewhere, anywhere else. The train lurched into motion with a pneumatic hiss and a metallic groan. James watched as Grand Central slipped away, as the tunnel walls flickered past in darkness, as they emerged into the snowy evening and began threading through the city streets. Queens, then the suburbs, then gradually the landscape opened up into the countryside of Connecticut and beyond. He didn't sleep, though he pretended to, keeping his eyes closed and his head against the window. Around him, the few other passengers settled in for the journey. Across the aisle, an elderly couple held hands and dozed. Further back, a young woman read a book by the overhead light. Near the front, a businessman worked on papers from his briefcase, utterly absorbed. All of them going somewhere, all of them, presumably, expected somewhere, all of them belonging to the world in a way James no longer felt he did. The snow fell heavier as they traveled north. By the time they crossed into Massachusetts, visibility was reduced to almost nothing. The train slowed, the engineer being cautious, and the rhythm of the rails became a slower, more deliberate percussion. James must have actually dozed then, because he jerked awake to find Porter standing over him with an apologetic expression. "Sorry to wake you, Mr. Whitmore," the conductor said, glancing at the ticket James had left on the seat beside him. "We've got a situation developing. There's a major storm system that's stalled over the coast. They're closing the line about 50 miles ahead of us. We're going to have to stop at the next station and wait it out." James sat up, rubbing his face. "How long?" "Hard to say. Could be a few hours, could be until morning. The storm's supposed to clear by dawn, but these things are unpredictable. The station we're stopping at is small, just a little coastal town called Quiet Harbor. Not much there, but there's a hotel nearby if folks want to get rooms for the night rather than waiting on the train."
Quiet Harbor, James repeated. He'd never heard of it. Nice little place, Porter said. Real quiet this time of year. Most of the summer people have gone back to the cities, but the locals are good folk. They'll take care of you if you need anything. The train was already slowing. Through the snow-obscured window, James could make out the faint lights of a small station. The platform was nearly empty, just a lone figure standing beneath a lamppost, a station master, perhaps, waiting to receive the unexpected train. They rolled to a stop with a final hiss of brakes. Porter moved through the car, making announcements, and the handful of passengers began gathering their things. The elderly couple decided to wait on the train. The businessman grumbled about missed meetings, but collected his briefcase. The young woman simply shrugged and smiled, apparently unconcerned. James wasn't sure what to do. Wait on the train in a darkened car, or step out into an unfamiliar town in a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. Both options seemed equally bleak. In the end, he grabbed his suitcase, simply because he didn't trust leaving it unattended. He'd step out, stretch his legs, maybe find some coffee if there was anything open. He certainly wasn't going to pay for a hotel room. He'd wait out the storm and continue on when the tracks cleared. The platform was slick with fresh snow when he stepped down. The cold hit him immediately, sharper than the city cold he was used to. This was coastal cold, damp and penetrating, finding every gap in his clothing. He pulled his collar up and looked around. The station was tiny, barely more than a covered platform with a small waiting room attached. The building was old, Victorian era, with decorative woodwork and a peaked roof heavy with snow. A single light burned in the waiting room window. The station master who'd been on the platform had already gone inside. Beyond the station, James could make out the vague shapes of buildings through the falling snow. The town seemed to rise up a hillside from the water. He could hear waves in the distance, a rhythmic crash against unseen rocks. A few lights glowed in windows here and there, warm yellow against the white snow and gray sky. The other passengers were dispersing. The businessman was already trudging up what appeared to be the main street, presumably toward the hotel Porter had mentioned. The young woman had been met by someone, an older woman with a warm embrace and exclamations of delight. They headed off together, arms linked, voices fading into the snow. James stood alone on the platform, suitcase in hand, and felt the full weight of his isolation settle over him like the falling snow. "You getting off or getting back on?" Porter called from the train car doorway. "We'll be here a while, but the heat's going off to save fuel. You might be more comfortable in the station." "I'm getting off," James said, making the decision as he spoke it. Porter nodded. "There's a hotel called the Harbor View Inn about 3 blocks up Main Street. Can't miss it. It's the biggest building in town. Tell Helen at the desk that Porter sent you. She'll treat you right." "Thanks," James said, the word feeling rusty in his mouth. He walked toward the waiting room, his footsteps muffled by the snow. Inside, blessed warmth radiated from a pot-bellied stove in the corner. The station master, a man in his 60s with a thick mustache and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from a ledger. "Rough night to be traveling. Storm came up faster than they predicted. You staying in town or waiting for the morning train?" "I don't know yet," admitted James. "Is there really a hotel?" "Aya, the Harbor View. Margaret runs it now that her husband passed. She'll have rooms available. Not many folks around this time of year. You need directions?" "I'm told it's up Main Street." "That's right. 3 blocks. Can't miss it. Big white Victorian with a wraparound porch. Only building with all its lights on. Margaret keeps them burning for travelers." The station master smiled. "She's a good soul. Believes in hospitality, especially at Christmas." James nodded his thanks and headed back into the snow. Main Street was exactly what you'd expect in a small Maine coastal town, narrow, lined with 2- and 3-story buildings, most of them dark at this hour. A general store, a diner, a hardware shop, a church with a white steeple. Everything closed, everything quiet. The snow was accumulating quickly, already several inches deep and still falling. James' shoes were not made for this, and by the time he spotted the Harbor View Inn, his feet were soaked and numb. The hotel was indeed the largest building on the street, a 3-story Victorian painted white with dark green shutters. Every window blazed with light, and smoke curled from 2 chimneys. A wreath hung on the front door, and garlands wrapped the porch railings. It looked like something from a Christmas card, almost aggressively cheerful. James climbed the porch steps and entered the lobby.
The warmth hit him first, then the smell. Pine from a massive Christmas tree in the corner, cinnamon and clove from somewhere deeper in the building, wood smoke from the fireplace. The lobby was decorated with an enthusiasm that bordered on excessive. Holly and ivy draped every surface, candles burned in every window, ornaments hung from the chandelier. Behind the front desk stood a woman in her early 60s, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a dark green dress with a white collar. She looked up from whatever she was writing and smiled, genuinely pleased to see him. "Welcome to the Harbor View. You must be from the train. Porter called ahead to let me know you might be stopping. I'm Margaret Hartley. Please, come in, come in. You look frozen half to death." James approached the desk, set down his suitcase, and tried to return the smile. It felt awkward on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "I need a room for the night," he said, "just until the train can continue." Of course. I have plenty of rooms available. Most of my regulars don't come in the winter. This is a summer town, you see. But I keep the place open year-round for travelers and the occasional unexpected guest." She pulled out a registration book. "Now, what's your name, dear?" "James Whitmore." She wrote it carefully. "And where are you coming from, Mr. Whitmore?" "New York." "Oh, how lovely. I haven't been to New York in years. My late husband and I went for our anniversary back in '48, saw a show on Broadway, walked through Central Park. Magical city." She looked up at him with kind eyes. "And where are you headed?" "Portland," he said shortly, not wanting to engage in conversation. If Margaret noticed his terseness, she didn't show it. "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. The room is $5 a night, includes breakfast. There's a sitting room through there if you'd like to warm up by the fire, and I can bring you some hot cider. Dinner service ended an hour ago, but I can fix you a plate if you're hungry." "Just the room," James said. He pulled out his wallet and placed a $5 bill on the counter. Margaret took the money and gave him a key attached to a wooden tag with the number 7 burned into it. "Top floor, end of the hall. It's our best room, has a view of the harbor, though you won't see much in this snow. Bathrooms shared, just across the hall, fresh towels in the closet." "Thank you." He picked up his suitcase and headed for the stairs. Behind him, Margaret called out, "Mr. Whitmore, we're having a little Christmas Eve gathering in the dining room at 8 o'clock. Nothing fancy, just some of the locals singing carols and sharing stories. You'd be welcome to join us if you'd like." "I'm tired," he said without turning around, "but thank you." He climbed the stairs, found room 7, and let himself in. The room was small but impeccably clean, with floral wallpaper, a brass bed covered in a hand-stitched quilt, and a washstand with a porcelain basin. The promised view was completely obscured by snow and darkness. James set his suitcase on the bed and sat down beside it. The room was warm, comfortable, decorated with the same cheerful Christmas spirit as the rest of the hotel. It should have been welcoming. Instead, it made him feel more alone than ever. He could hear sounds from below, voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses.
The Christmas gathering Margaret had mentioned, the sounds of people who belonged somewhere with someone celebrating together. James lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. He'd wait out the storm, board the morning train, and continue north to Portland. Once there, he'd— what? Find work? Start over? Disappear into a life of anonymous solitude? He didn't have answers. He only knew he couldn't go back. Sometime later, he wasn't sure how long, there was a soft knock on his door. He considered not answering, but the knock came again, gentle but persistent. He opened the door to find a girl of about 10 years old standing in the hallway holding a tray with a covered plate and a hot mug. "Mrs. Hartley said you might be hungry," the girl said. She had dark braids and serious brown eyes. "I brought you some supper." "I didn't order anything," James said. "I know, but Mrs. Hartley says nobody should go to bed hungry on Christmas Eve. It's roast chicken and potatoes and green beans and hot cider with cinnamon." James found himself taking the tray simply because it seemed easier than arguing with a child. "Thank you." The girl nodded solemnly. "You're welcome. I'm Lucy. My mama works in the kitchen. I help sometimes." "That's nice." Lucy studied him with the frank curiosity of children. "Are you sad?" The question caught him off guard. "What?" "You look sad. My mama says people get sad at Christmas sometimes, if they miss people or if they're lonely. Are you lonely?" James didn't know how to answer. He settled for, "I'm fine. Thank you for the food, Lucy." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and turned to go. Then she paused and looked back. "There's singing downstairs if you change your mind. It's nice. Everybody's welcome." She skipped away down the hall before James could respond. He closed the door, set the tray on the small table by the window, and looked at the food. It smelled wonderful. He realized he hadn't eaten since early morning and barely noticed the hunger until now.
He ate slowly, mechanically, tasting nothing. The food was good, homemade and hearty, but it was just fuel. Below, he could hear the singing starting. Silent night in multiple harmonizing voices, warm and slightly imperfect in the way that made it genuine. When he finished eating, he set the tray outside his door as he'd seen others do in hotels, then lay back down on the bed. He meant to just rest for a moment, but exhaustion pulled him under like a tide, and within minutes he was deeply asleep. He woke to sunlight. Bright, clear winter sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes in the air and painting squares of light on the wooden floor. James sat up, disoriented. The storm had passed. He'd slept through the night. He checked his watch. Nearly 9 in the morning, far later than he usually slept. The train must have left hours ago. He went to the window and pulled back the curtain. What he saw took his breath away. Quiet harbor spread out below him, a picture postcard of a New England coastal town. Buildings with peaked roofs heavy with snow, smoke curling from dozens of chimneys, icicles hanging like crystal from eaves and lampposts. The main street curved down to a small harbor where fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings, their decks piled with fresh snow. Beyond that, the ocean stretched to the horizon, a deep blue-gray under a cloudless sky. It was beautiful, painfully, unexpectedly beautiful. There was a knock at his door, a different knock than last night, firmer. "Mr. Whitmore, it's Margaret. I wanted to let you know about the train situation." James pulled on his pants and opened the door. Margaret stood there with a sympathetic expression. "I'm afraid I have bad news," she said. "The storm brought down a tree across the tracks about 5 miles north of here. The railroad crew is working on clearing it, but they say it'll be at least until tomorrow before trains can run again, possibly the day after, depending on how much damage there is to the rails underneath." James felt a sinking in his chest. Tomorrow at the earliest? "I'm sorry. I know you're eager to get to Portland, but there's nothing for it. The tracks are impassable."
She smiled gently. "The good news is you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. Same rate, and since it's Christmas Day, breakfast is complimentary." "Christmas," James repeated numbly. He'd forgotten it was Christmas morning. "That's right. We're doing a big dinner this afternoon at 2 o'clock. You'd be more than welcome to join us. It's not just hotel guests. Half the town comes. It's tradition." "I'll be fine in my room," James said. "Well, the offer stands. Breakfast is being served in the dining room for the next hour if you'd like something to eat." Margaret turned to go, then paused. "Mr. Whitmore, I hope you don't think I'm prying, but you seem like a man carrying a heavy burden. Whatever it is, I hope you know that here in Quiet Harbor, we believe in fresh starts. Nobody asks too many questions about the past. We're more interested in who you are today." She left before James could formulate a response. He washed and dressed, then reluctantly went downstairs. The dining room was about half full, several families with children, a few older couples, and scattered individuals like himself. The atmosphere was cheerful but not overwhelming, people wishing each other Merry Christmas, but giving space too. "Mind if I join you?" James looked up to find a man in his 40s standing beside the table, coffee cup in hand, friendly smile on his weathered face. He wore work clothes, flannel shirt, canvas pants, boots, and had calloused hands of someone who worked with them. "I suppose," James said, not wanting company but not wanting to be openly rude either. The man sat down. "Name's Tom Fletcher. I run the hardware store down the street. Well, co-run it with my brother. Family business." James Whitmore. "Heard you got stranded by the storm. Tough luck, especially at Christmas." "It's fine." "You have family waiting for you in Portland?" "No." Tom took a sip of coffee, seemingly unbothered by James's curt responses. "This your first time in Quiet Harbor?" "Yes."
It's a special place. Not much to look at, I suppose, if you're used to cities, but it grows on you. People here, they take care of each other. When my brother got sick a few years back, the whole town rallied, made sure his kids were looked after, his bills were paid, his store stayed running until he recovered. That's the kind of place this is. James nodded, not knowing what to say to that. In New York, he'd barely known his neighbors' names. "Anyway," Tom said, standing up, "I just wanted to introduce myself, make you feel welcome. If you need anything while you're here, directions, recommendations, whatever, feel free to stop by the store. And if you're looking for something to do today, the Christmas dinner Margaret's putting on is always a good time. No pressure, just extending the invitation." He walked away, leaving James alone with his breakfast and his thoughts. The morning passed slowly. James returned to his room, unsure what to do with himself. He couldn't work, he had no projects. He couldn't read, he had no books. He could only sit and wait and think, which was the last thing he wanted to do. Around noon, unable to stand the confinement any longer, he put on his overcoat and went for a walk. The cold was sharp but clean, and the snow crunched satisfyingly under his inadequate city shoes. Main Street was quiet, most people inside preparing for dinner or gathered at the church. James walked without destination, simply moving to be moving. He passed the hardware store, closed today, but with a sign wishing passers-by a Merry Christmas. The diner, also closed. The general store open with a few customers inside. At the end of Main Street, he found a small park overlooking the harbor with benches and a gazebo heavy with snow. He brushed snow off a bench and sat, looking out at the water. Ice was forming along the edges of the harbor, but the center was still open, the boats rocking gently. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries harsh but somehow fitting in this landscape. "Beautiful, isn't it?" James turned to find an elderly man settling onto the other end of the bench. He wore a thick wool coat and a captain's cap, and his face was weathered like driftwood, mapped with years of sun and salt. "I suppose," James said. "Been coming to this spot for 60 years. Never gets old. The harbor's different every day. Different light, different weather, different mood, but always beautiful." They sat in silence for a moment. Then the old man extended a gnarled hand. "Henry Walsh. Most folks call me Captain Henry. Used to run a fishing boat out of this harbor. Retired now." James shook his hand. "James Whitmore." "Pleased to meet you, James Whitmore. You're the fella from the train, aren't you? Word gets around quick in a small town." "So I'm learning." Captain Henry chuckled. "Don't mind the curiosity. We don't get many strangers in winter. Summer, the place is full of tourists, but come October, it's just us locals again. We like it that way, mostly. Quieter, more ourselves." "Must be hard," James said, surprising himself by engaging in conversation, living in a place that's only busy part of the year. "It's what we're used to. The summer people bring money, keep the businesses running, but winter's when we remember who we are, when we take care of each other without outsiders watching. It's good for the soul." James thought about that. "I used to live somewhere busy all the time. The city never slept, never slowed down. I thought I liked that, thought the energy was what made it exciting. And now? I'm not sure what I think." Captain Henry nodded wisely. "That's usually when the thinking starts to matter, when you're not sure anymore. Means you're open to seeing things differently." They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the gulls and the boats and the way the sunlight sparkled on the snow. After a while, Captain Henry stood. "I should head back. My daughter's expecting me for dinner. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. She always makes too much food." "Thank you, but I'll manage." "Suit yourself. But if you change your mind, we're the Blue House on Harbor View Lane, just up from the church. Doors always open." The captain tipped his cap. "Merry Christmas, James Whitmore. I hope you find what you're looking for, even if you don't know what it is yet." He walked away, leaving James alone with that cryptic statement. The afternoon was waning when James finally returned to the hotel. The lobby was bustling with activity, people arriving for the Christmas dinner, carrying dishes and presents, greeting each other with hugs and laughter. Children ran through the corridors, their excitement barely contained. The smell of roasting turkey and fresh-baked bread filled the air. Margaret spotted James trying to slip past toward the stairs. "Mr. Whitmore, perfect timing. We're just about to serve dinner. There's plenty of room at the table." "I don't want to intrude," James said automatically. "Intrude? Nonsense. This is a community dinner. Everyone's welcome, locals and visitors alike. Come on, there's someone I'd like you to meet." Before he could protest, Margaret had taken his arm and was steering him toward the dining room. The space had been transformed, several tables pushed together to create one long banquet table, covered in white cloth and set with mismatched china that somehow looked perfect together. Candles burned in holders down the center, surrounded by pine boughs and holly. People were already taking their seats, filling the room with chatter and warmth. Margaret led James to a chair about halfway down the table, next to a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. "James, this is Dr. Eleanor Winters. She runs our medical clinic here in town. Eleanor, this is James Whitmore, stranded by the storm." Eleanor shook his hand with a warm smile. "Nice to meet you, James. Don't let the title intimidate you. I'm just a country doctor. Mostly I treat fishing injuries and children's colds." James shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip. "Nice to meet you." Margaret bustled away to oversee the serving of food, and Eleanor gestured to the seat beside her. "Please, sit. Fair warning, these dinners can get a bit chaotic, but the food is wonderful, and the company's even better." James sat reluctantly. On his other side was Tom Fletcher, the hardware store owner he'd met at breakfast. Across from him was Lucy, the little girl who'd brought him dinner last night, now sitting between her mother and father and grinning at him. "You came," Lucy said happily. "I told Mama you would."
"Lucy has good instincts about people," her mother said, reaching across to shake James's hand. "I'm Sarah Bennett. I work in the kitchen here. Thank you for being kind to my daughter last night." "I didn't do anything," James said, uncomfortable with the attention. "You talked to her. That's something." The meal began with a blessing offered by the pastor of the local church, a young man with an earnest face and a slight stutter. Then dishes started circulating: turkey and ham, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans and carrots, cranberry sauce and stuffing, fresh rolls with butter. The food kept coming in a seemingly endless parade. James filled his plate more out of obligation than hunger, but once he started eating, he realized he was actually enjoying it. The food was simple but prepared with care, and there was something comforting about eating at a table surrounded by people, even if he didn't know them. Eleanor proved to be an engaging dinner companion. She didn't pry into his background, but talked easily about the town, her work, the characters that made up the community. "We're a strange little place," she said, passing him the gravy boat.
"We're a strange little place," Eleanor said, passing him the gravy boat. "Too small to be a real town, too big to be just a village. Most of the year we're forgotten by the rest of the world, and honestly, we prefer it that way. The people who live here do so because they want to, not because they have to." "You chose to come here?" James asked, genuinely curious despite himself. "I did. I grew up in Boston, went to medical school there, had offers from several hospitals in the city. But I did a rotation in a rural clinic and fell in love with small-town medicine. The personal connections, knowing your patients as people, not just cases, being part of a community." She smiled. "My colleagues thought I was insane, throwing away a promising career to patch up fishermen in the middle of nowhere. Do you regret it? Not for a single day. This is where I'm meant to be." She looked at him thoughtfully. "What about you, James? Where are you meant to be?" The question struck him harder than it should have. "I don't know anymore. I thought I knew. Turns out I was wrong." "That's not failure," Eleanor said gently. "That's growth. Realizing you were wrong is the first step to finding what's right." Before James could respond, Margaret stood at the head of the table and tapped her glass with a spoon. The room gradually quieted. "Thank you all for being here," Margaret said, her voice warm with genuine affection. "This is my favorite day of the year, having all of you gathered under one roof, sharing food and fellowship. Before we continue with dessert, and yes, there are 3 kinds of pie, I'd like to observe our traditional Christmas sharing. For those who don't know, we go around a table and each person shares something they're grateful for this year." A murmur of approval went around the table. Margaret started, speaking about her gratitude for good health and the friends who'd helped her keep the hotel running after her husband's passing. Then it moved to the person beside her, and around the table it went. Tom Fletcher was grateful for his brother's recovery. Captain Henry was grateful for another year of watching the harbor. Sarah Bennett was grateful for her daughter's health and happiness. Lucy was grateful for her new kitten. Eleanor was grateful for the trust her patients placed in her. And then it came to James. Everyone was looking at him expectantly. He felt trapped, unable to think of anything to say. What was he grateful for? His failures? His isolation? The fact that he'd been stranded in this town against his will? He started, then stopped. The silence stretched. "I'm grateful for this meal," he finally said, the words stiff and awkward, "and for people's kindness to a stranger." It wasn't much, but it was true. Eleanor smiled at him, and Margaret nodded approvingly, and the sharing continued around the rest of the table. After dinner came the promised pies, apple, pumpkin, and mince, along with coffee and conversation. The formal structure of the meal dissolved, and people began moving around, clustering in small groups, children running between the adults. Someone produced a guitar, and caroling began again. James found himself standing awkwardly near the fireplace, pie plate in hand, watching the celebration swirl around him. He felt like a ghost observing the living, present but not part of things. "You look like you're planning an escape route." He turned to find Eleanor beside him, coffee cup in hand, an amused expression on her face. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's felt the same way. I remember my first community gathering here. I just arrived in town, didn't know anyone, felt completely out of place. I spent half the evening trying to figure out how to leave without being rude." "What changed?" "Captain Henry told me a story." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "He said Quiet Harbor was like a lobster trap, easy to wander into, but the longer you stayed, the harder it was to leave. Not because anyone was keeping you, but because you realized you didn't want to go." "I'm only here until the tracks are cleared," James said firmly. "Of course," Eleanor said, but something in her tone suggested she didn't quite believe him. The evening wore on. James made several attempts to excuse himself and retreat to his room, but each time someone drew him into conversation. Captain Henry wanted to tell him about the Great Blizzard of 1923. Tom Fletcher wanted his opinion on some architectural detail of the hardware store's facade. Even Lucy found him to ask if he wanted to play checkers. He found himself saying yes to the checkers, sitting at a small table in the corner, while Lucy methodically demolished him in 3 consecutive games. "You're not very good at this," Lucy observed, without malice. "No," James admitted, "I suppose I'm not." "That's okay. My papa's not good at it either, but he still plays with me." She set up the board for another game. "Are you going to stay in Quiet Harbor?" "Just until the train can leave." "That's what Dr. Eleanor said when she first came, and Mr. Tom, and lots of people, but they stayed." "Why did they stay?" Lucy considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in thought. "I think because they liked it here, because people were nice to them, and because sometimes when you find a place that feels like home, you don't want to leave, even if you didn't mean to stay." Out of the mouths of babes, James thought. He studied the child across from him, this serious little girl with her braids and her wisdom beyond her years. "Lucy, do you like it here, in Quiet Harbor?" "I love it here. Everyone knows me. Everyone's nice. In summer, I swim in the harbor, and in winter, I go sledding on Miller's Hill. My best friend lives 3 doors down, and we go to school together. And when I'm sick, Dr. Eleanor comes to see me, and she always makes me feel better." Lucy moved a checker piece. "Don't you have a place like that?" "I used to think I did," James said quietly, "but I was wrong. Maybe you just haven't found the right place yet." The next morning brought news that the track repairs would take longer than expected. Damage to the rails themselves meant replacement sections needed to be brought in. The earliest the trains would run would be December 27th, possibly the 28th. James accepted this information with resignation. He was stuck, at least for a few more days. He paid Margaret for an extended stay and settled into an uncomfortable limbo, not leaving, but not really staying either, just existing in the in-between. To fill the time, he began walking the town. Quiet Harbor was small enough to explore thoroughly in a day, but he found himself returning to certain spots: the park overlooking the water, the small library housed in a converted church, the rocky beach at the edge of town where the waves crashed dramatic and wild. On his second morning, Tom Fletcher caught him examining the hardware store's facade. "See something interesting?" Tom asked, coming out to stand beside him. "Your cornice is original," James said, pointing to the decorative woodwork under the roof. 1880s, if I'm not mistaken. Beautiful craftsmanship. They don't make 'em like that anymore." Tom looked up at the building as if seeing it for the first time. "I've walked past that my whole life and never really looked at it. You know about this kind of thing?" "I'm an architect." "Was an architect," James caught himself. "I worked in New York, modern buildings mostly."
Modern's fine, but there's something about the old work, isn't there? The care they took. Nothing was just functional. Everything had to be beautiful, too. Tom studied James. You know, the old Masonic Hall at the end of town has been empty for 5 years. The Historical Society's been trying to figure out what to do with it, but the building needs work. Been trying to find someone who could assess it, tell us what's salvageable. You interested in taking a look? James started to decline automatically, then stopped. What else did he have to do? I suppose I could take a look. The Masonic Hall turned out to be a gem, a 3-story brick building from 1995 with arched windows and elaborate stonework. It was in rough shape, with a leaking roof and crumbling mortar, but the bones were good. Tom unlocked the door, and they stepped into a dusty, echoing space. Weak winter sunlight filtered through dirty windows, illuminating a grand hall with a vaulted ceiling, a stage at one end, and a gallery running around the upper level. They used to hold town meetings here, Tom said, his voice echoing. Dances, theater performances, everything. Then they built the community center in the 60s, and this place just got forgotten. James walked slowly through the space, his architect's eye automatically cataloging what he saw. Water damage here, structural issues there, but overall remarkably intact. The decorative plasterwork on the ceiling was still beautiful despite the neglect. The hardwood floors needed refinishing, but weren't beyond saving. It's a crime to let a building like this decay, he said, running his hand along a windowsill. So it can be saved?
With the right work, yes. It would take money and expertise, but it could be restored, maybe repurposed. The structure is sound, that's the important thing. Tom grinned. Think you could write that up? Put together a report for the Historical Society? They've been arguing for months about whether to try to save it or tear it down. An expert opinion might help. I'm not really an expert. You're more expert than anyone else around here, and it would give you something to do while you're waiting for the train. James found himself agreeing and spent the afternoon measuring and noting and sketching. It felt good to use those skills again, to lose himself in the practical problems of assessing a structure. By the time he returned to the hotel, he had several pages of notes and a rough floor plan. Eleanor found him in the hotel's sitting room that evening, bent over his sketches. Tom told me you're helping with the Masonic Hall, she said, settling into the chair across from him. That's wonderful. The Historical Society will be thrilled. It's just an assessment, nothing special. It's special to us. That building is part of our history. If it can be saved, it should be. She watched him work for a moment. You seem different today, more engaged. James looked up. It's just something to pass the time. Is it? Eleanor's green eyes were knowing. Or is it something you've been missing? He didn't answer, but they both knew the truth. Over the next few days, James fell into an unexpected routine. Mornings he spent at the Masonic Hall, assessing every room, every structural element. Afternoons he worked on his report, sitting in the hotel or the library, translating his findings into clear recommendations. Evenings he found himself drawn back to the hotel's sitting room, where various townspeople gathered. He met more of Quiet Harbor's residents. There was Frank Chen, who ran the diner and made the best clam chowder James had ever tasted. There was Reverend Matthews, the young pastor, who stuttered, disappeared when he talked about fishing. There was old Mrs. Peterson, who'd lived in the same house for 73 years and could tell stories about every building in town. And always there was Eleanor, somehow present without being intrusive, drawing him into conversations, making him feel included without making him feel obligated. On the third evening, she invited him to dinner at her cottage. Nothing fancy, she assured him, just a simple meal and some conversation, unless you'd rather eat at the hotel. James surprised himself by accepting. Eleanor's cottage was a small, neat building on a quiet street, painted yellow with white trim. Inside it was warm and comfortable, filled with books and plants and the kind of lived-in coziness that spoke of a person who'd made a real home. She cooked while James sat at the kitchen table, and they talked. Not about his past, she didn't ask, but about architecture and medicine,
about books they'd read and places they'd been. She told him about her work, about the old fisherman who refused to take his blood pressure medicine, and the young mother who thought every sniffle was pneumonia. "It's not glamorous," Eleanor said, stirring something on the stove, "but it matters. That's what I love about small-town medicine. I'm not just treating symptoms, I'm caring for people I know, in a community I'm part of." "Don't you ever miss the city? The resources, the specialization, the excitement?" "Sometimes I miss the symphony, and good Chinese food. Frank tries, but it's not the same," she smiled. "But what I have here is worth more than those things. I have purpose, I have community, I have a life that feels meaningful, not just successful." Over dinner, a simple but delicious chicken stew with fresh bread, James found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. "I thought I wanted success," he said quietly. "I thought if I could design important buildings, make a name for myself, prove I was somebody, that would be enough. That would make me matter." "And did it?" Eleanor asked gently. "For a while, or I told myself it did, but it was all surface. I worked 80-hour weeks. I didn't have real friends, just colleagues and contacts. I was engaged to a woman I barely knew because she fit the image of what a successful architect's wife should be." He pushed food around his plate. "When everything fell apart, I realized there was nothing underneath, no foundation, just ambition and ego." "What happened?" Eleanor asked gently. So he told her about the embezzlement investigation, about his defensive reaction, about how he'd been willing to throw others under the bus to save himself, about the shattered engagement and the lost career and the slow dissolution of everything he'd built.
"I wasn't the villain," he said. "I didn't steal anything, but I wasn't the hero either. I was just a man so focused on protecting himself that I didn't care who else got hurt. And when people realized that about me, they didn't want me around anymore." Eleanor listened without judgment, without offering platitudes or easy forgiveness. "So you ran," she said when he finished. "I ran," he confirmed. "Got on a train heading north because north seemed as good a direction as any. Away seemed like the only option left. And then you got stranded here." "And then I got stranded here," James echoed. He looked at her across the table. "Why are you being kind to me? You don't know me. For all you know, I'm exactly the selfish person I've just described." "Maybe you were that person," Eleanor said, "but I don't think you are anymore. People change, James. They grow. They learn from their mistakes. The man who got on that train in New York might have been running away, but the man I've gotten to know this week is starting to look for something to run toward." On the morning of December 27th, James woke to find a message had been slipped under his door. The tracks were clear. The first train north would arrive at 2 p.m. He sat on the edge of his bed, holding the piece of paper, feeling something heavy settle in his chest. He should have been relieved. He could finally leave, continue on to Portland, start whatever new life he'd been planning. But Portland was just a destination he'd picked at random. He had no job waiting there, no friends, no reason to go except that he'd bought a ticket. Quiet Harbor, on the other hand. He dressed and went downstairs to find the hotel in its usual morning bustle. Margaret was at the desk, and she looked up when she saw him. "You heard about the train," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Well, your room's paid through today. You're welcome to stay until the train arrives. Or," she paused, "you're welcome to stay longer, if you'd like. No pressure, but the offer stands." James thanked her and went to breakfast. The dining room was quieter than usual, and he realized with surprise that he recognized everyone there. The elderly couple who read the newspaper together every morning, the businessman who'd been stranded with him, who'd decided to extend his stay and had been conducting his work by telephone, Frank Chen having a quick meal before opening the diner. They all nodded to him, wished him good morning, welcomed him as one of them. After breakfast, James walked to the Masonic Hall one last time. His report was finished, typed up neatly on the hotel's typewriter, and ready to present to the Historical Society. But he wanted to see the building again, to say goodbye to the old project that had given him unexpected purpose. Tom found him there, standing in the grand hall, looking up at the vaulted ceiling. "Came to say farewell to the old girl?" Tom asked. "Something like that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Tom said, "The Historical Society met last night, read your report. They're going to try to save the building. Might take a few years to raise the money, but they're committed. And they want to know if you'd be willing to consult on the restoration, oversee the architectural work." James turned to him to look at him. "I'm leaving today, the train." "I know about the train, but trains run both ways. You could come back. Or," he met his eyes directly, "or you could stay. We could use an architect here, not just for the Masonic Hall. There are buildings all over town that need assessment, preservation work, and new construction too. Summer people always wanting additions and renovations. It wouldn't be New York money, but it would be honest work." "I don't know," James said, feeling something that might have been hope and might have been fear. "Think about it," Tom said. "The offer's open-ended." James spent the rest of the morning walking the town one last time, past the diner where Frank waved from the window, past the church where Reverend Matthews was shoveling the front steps, past Eleanor's cottage, though he didn't stop. He found himself at the park overlooking the harbor, sitting on the same bench where he'd talked with Captain Henry. The old man was there again, as if he'd been waiting. "Train's coming this afternoon," Captain Henry said. "You leaving on it?" "That was the plan." "Was," Captain Henry repeated, picking up on the past tense. "But not is?" James didn't answer immediately. He watched the boats in the harbor, the gulls wheeling overhead, the way the winter sun made the water sparkle. "I told you this place was like a lobster trap," Captain Henry said with a gentle smile. "Easy to wander into, hard to leave. But here's the thing about that trap. It's only a trap if you don't want to be there. If you choose it, it's not a trap anymore. It's a home." At 1 o'clock, James returned to the hotel. He found Margaret in the kitchen, overseeing the preparation of lunch. "Could I talk to you for a moment?" he asked. They stepped into her small office. Margaret looked at him with those kind, knowing eyes. "I'd like to extend my stay, indefinitely, if that's all right. I'll need to go to New York to get my things, settle my affairs, but I'd like to come back. I'd like to make this my home base, at least for a while. See if this could work." Margaret's smile was radiant. "Oh, James, I'm so glad. And yes, of course, I'll keep your room ready for you. When will you go to New York?" "I'll take today's train, get everything sorted. Be back in a week or so, if that's all right." "It's more than all right. It's wonderful." James had one more stop to make. He walked to Eleanor's cottage and knocked on the door. She answered in her work clothes, clearly just back from the clinic. "James," she said, surprised, "I thought you'd be getting ready for the train." "I am, but I needed to tell you something first." He took a breath. "I'm going to New York to get my things, to close up that chapter of my life, but I'm coming back. Tom offered me work, and I'm going to take it. I'm going to stay here in Quiet Harbor, if that's all right with you." Eleanor's face lit up with a joy she didn't try to hide. "If it's all right with me, James, it's more than all right. I'm so happy you're staying." "I don't know if this will work," he said honestly. "I don't know if I can be the person this town seems to think I can be, but I want to try. For the first time in years, I actually want to try." Eleanor stepped forward and took his hand. "That's all anyone can do. Try. And whatever happens, you won't be doing it alone. That's what community means."
The train pulled into Quiet Harbor at 2 p.m., right on schedule. James boarded with a single suitcase, but this time he had a return ticket in his pocket.
This time he knew where he was going, and more importantly, where he was coming back to. The journey to New York felt different. He watched the landscape roll past with new eyes, seeing not what he was leaving behind, but what waited ahead. The week in Quiet Harbor had shifted something fundamental in him, had shown him a different way of living. In New York, he worked quickly. He packed up his apartment, keeping only what mattered: his drafting tools, some books, a few photographs, including one of Eleanor from his wedding that he'd kept hidden in a drawer. He met with his landlord, closed his bank accounts, said goodbye to the few people who still spoke to him. On his last night in the city, he took a walk through Midtown, looking at the buildings he'd once dreamed of designing. They were impressive, certainly, monuments of glass and steel reaching toward the sky. But they were cold, too, impersonal, designed to impress rather than to serve. He thought about the Masonic Hall in Quiet Harbor, with its human scale and decorative details, built by people who cared about beauty as much as function. He thought about restoration instead of demolition, about preserving history instead of erasing it. He was ready to go home. The journey back felt eternal. James found himself counting the hours, the miles, watching impatiently as they crossed through Connecticut, into Massachusetts, through New Hampshire, finally into Maine. When the conductor announced they were approaching Quiet Harbor, James's heart actually leaped. The train pulled into the station just after dusk on New Year's Eve. The platform was dusted with fresh snow, and lights glowed in the small terminal building. As James stepped down from the train, he saw a small crowd waiting. Tom and his brother, Frank from the diner, Reverend Matthews, little Lucy and her parents, Captain Henry leaning on his walking stick, Margaret from the hotel, and Eleanor standing at the front, her face alight with welcome. "Welcome home, James," she called out as he approached. Welcome home. 2 words he'd never thought would mean so much. They gathered around him, taking his suitcases, asking about his trip, welcoming him back as if he'd been gone for months instead of days. Someone mentioned that the New Year's Eve celebration was starting at the hotel in an hour, and James was expected to attend. As the crowd dispersed and people headed toward their cars and homes, Eleanor fell into step beside James. "How was New York?" she asked. "Loud, crowded, cold in a way that has nothing to do with temperature." He looked at her. "I couldn't wait to leave." "I'm glad you came back." "So am I." They walked through the snowy streets toward the hotel, and James felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he belonged, like he was where he was meant to be. The Masonic Hall restoration was complete, and the town had turned out for the dedication ceremony. James stood on the stage in the grand hall, looking at the crowd that filled the space. The building had been transformed, the roof repaired, the windows restored, the plasterwork cleaned and recolored, the floors refinished to a honey gold glow. It had taken 3 years and the combined effort of the entire community. Local contractors donated labor. The Historical Society raised funds. James had overseen every detail, ensuring the restoration honored the building's history while making it functional for modern use. The space would now serve as a community center, a gathering place for performances and meetings and celebrations. It was exactly what Quiet Harbor needed, and James was proud to have been part of making it happen. As he spoke about the restoration process, he looked out into the audience and saw the people who'd become his family. Tom and his brother, who'd worked on the project from day one. Captain Henry, older now but still sharp. Margaret, beaming with pride. Frank, who'd catered every Historical Society meeting. Reverend Matthews, who'd held a special blessing ceremony when they broke ground. And Eleanor, sitting in the front row, her hand resting on her rounded belly.
They'd married 2 years ago in a simple ceremony at the church, and their first child was due in the spring. James had designed and built them a house on a lot overlooking the arbor, every detail chosen with love and care.
Lucy was there too, now 15, and already talking about becoming an architect herself. She'd been James's unofficial assistant on the Masonic Hall project, learning to read blueprints and measure spaces. After the ceremony, as people milled around, admiring the restored building and sampling Frank's catering, Eleanor came up beside James. "You did it," she said, slipping her hand into his. "You brought this place back to life." "We did it," James corrected. "All of us together." "That's what I love about you," Eleanor said. "You understand now that nothing worth doing is ever done alone." James pulled her close, careful of her belly, and looked around at the building he'd helped save, the community that had saved him. 5 years ago, he'd been a broken man on a train heading nowhere, running from failure and convinced his life was over at 34. Now he was 39, with a career he loved, a wife he adored, a child on the way, and a community that depended on him as much as he depended on them. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Giving up New York? The big career?" James thought about it, honestly. "Not for a single moment. This is the life I was meant to have. I just didn't know it until a snowstorm stranded me in a town I'd never heard of." "The best things in life are usually the ones we don't plan for," Eleanor said. That night, after the celebration ended and they'd walked home through the snowy streets, James stood at the window of their bedroom looking out at the harbor. The water was dark and mysterious, dotted with lights from the boats moored there. Above, stars scattered across a clear winter sky. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the train that had broken down at exactly the right time, about the people who'd welcomed a stranger and given him a second chance, about the woman who'd seen past his defenses to the person he could become. Sometimes getting lost was the only way to find yourself. Sometimes the detours life forced upon you led you exactly where you needed to be. Sometimes the end of one story was just the beginning of another, better one. James Whitmore had come to Quiet Harbor running away from his past. He'd stayed because he'd found his future. And in the morning, he'd wake up in this house he'd built, next to the woman he loved, in the town that had become his home, and he'd go to work on his next project, a small renovation on the library, nothing grand, but work that mattered to people who mattered to him. It was a good life, a quiet life, a life built not on ambition or success, but on connection and purpose and love. It was, he thought, as he climbed into bed beside Eleanor, exactly the life he'd been searching for all along. And so ends our journey to Quiet Harbor, where a man who thought he'd lost everything discovered that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. James Whitmore boarded that train on Christmas Eve as a man running away. He got off as a man running toward something, toward community, toward purpose, toward love, toward home. The snowstorm that stranded him wasn't an obstacle, it was an opportunity, a chance to see that there was another way to live, another way to measure success, another way to be. I wonder, dear listener, what would happen if you got stranded? Not on a train, perhaps, but in your life. If circumstances forced you to stop running, to pause, to look around at where you actually are, instead of where you think you should be going. What might you discover? Who might you meet? What version of yourself might emerge if you gave it permission? Sometimes the detours are the journey. Sometimes getting lost is how we find ourselves. Sometimes the things we think are endings are really just beginnings in disguise.
Thank you for traveling with me tonight, for spending this time in Quiet Harbor, for opening your heart to James's story. If this tale touched you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Have you ever had a moment when everything changed? A place that became home unexpectedly? A second chance that transformed your life? And if you'd like more stories like this, tales of hope and healing, of communities and second chances, of the magic that happens when we're brave enough to start over, please subscribe and join our growing community. Your support means everything. Until next time, dear friend, may you have the courage to take detours. May you find welcome in unexpected places. May you recognize home when you see it, even if it's not where you plan to go. And may you always, always give yourself permission to begin again. Good night, dream well, and remember, somewhere out there, in a small town you've never heard of, there might be a life waiting for you that's better than anything you could have planned. Good night.